guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today I am here to talk about some of the books that I read in December and January. I feel like my December reads always get lost in that shuffle of year-end lists and whatnot. So because I didn't get around to filming a more timely December wrap-up, I thought I would do a two-part January reading wrap-up. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the more literary fiction and nonfiction that I read over the past couple months. And then tomorrow I will be back to talk about some of the romance novels that I've been reading recently. And I also want to do some booktube shoutouts and talk about a few of the books on my February TBR as well. So definitely keep an eye out for that half of the wrap-up coming tomorrow. But in the meantime, let's dive right into some of the more literary books that I've read recently. First up, I wanted to quickly mention A Lovers Discourse by Xiaolu, which I talked about during my Thanksgiving reading vlog and then finished reading in December. And this novel follows a Chinese woman who moves to the UK to do her PhD right in the midst of the 2016 Brexit vote. And while she's there, she ends up meeting and falling in love with this German-Australian landscape architect. And so this book traces the arcs of her relationship with this guy and also her relationship with London and the UK and Western culture and thought more generally. And this novel takes its title from Roland Barthes' famous work, A Lovers Discourse, and it's similarly structured in that it's made up of these short chapters that each have a very descriptive subject line and that open with a brief excerpt. But where Barthes uses that motif to create a sense that he is cataloging the condition of love, here it feels more like empty cosmetic imitation, because the book really doesn't engage with Barthes and his ideas beyond kind of the structure of the book. The idea of imitation and reproduction is echoed a bit later in the novel when our narrator is studying this village of amateur Chinese painters who produce copies of great Western artworks. But beyond that, Xiaolu really doesn't go anywhere else with that thematic thread. And that kind of leads into my issue with this book as a whole, which is that Xiaolu has such a sharp eye and makes some really smart and striking and often quite funny and clever observations, particularly about the UK and Western society. And she also writes really beautifully at times about the narrator's loneliness in this new city and also her complicated feelings of nostalgia for China and the village that she grew up in, a village that no longer exists because it's been replaced by a highway. And so there's a lot of really great stuff here, a lot of really great parts and pieces, but ultimately none of it ever feels like it fully comes together into a cohesive whole, either thematically or narratively. And so it all just felt kind of baggy and aimless at the end of the day. Another book that fell a bit short for me was Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu, which won the National Book Award for Fiction last year. This story follows Willis Wu, who lives in an overcrowded Chinatown SRO in Los Angeles and who is a background actor on a procedural cop show called Black and White. And this book follows his efforts to break out of the role of generic Asian man number one and to one day be cast as Kung Fu Guy, which is the highest height that any Asian actor can hope to ascend to in Hollywood. And this is a novel, but it is structured like a screenplay, which allows Charles Yu to employ a very meta kind of storytelling, wherein as you're reading, you're never really quite sure if you are in the world of Black and White, if you're in the real world, on a Chinatown set, or in the actual Chinatown. You're never quite sure if the characters are on script or off script, or if the whole book is just one giant meta script. All of those lines between different worlds, between public performance and private performance and on-screen performance, all of those boundaries blur in a way that is really provocative and surprising. And it allows you to see and consider how Willis and everyone else in Chinatown is playing a number of different parts on a number of different stages, acting out different roles and identities depending on the audience and the set dressing. And especially early on in the book, Charles Yu does a beautiful job of evoking all of those different shifting identities. There's one scene in particular where Willis goes to see his old teacher Sifu, Sifu, who is a martial arts legend in Chinatown and who was at one point Kung Fu guy in Hollywood, but who has now devolved into the role of old Asian man, kind of forgotten and dismissed. And then in one final shift, you realize that Sifu is also Willis's dad. And it's just such a masterful and innovative way to illustrate the experience of double consciousness in America. And as a side note, the first half of this book, interestingly, also really reminded me of Milkman by Anna Burns, just in terms of how Charles Yu depicts the close-knit claustrophobia of the Chinatown community and how everyone there finds themselves trapped into these social roles and generic identities that they can't break out of. And so for the first half of this book, I genuinely thought that I was potentially reading like a new masterpiece, just because it was so unlike anything I've read before. And I was so eager to see how Charles Yu would continue to flesh out that idea of multiple worlds and multiple identities coexisting on top of one another. And I also really thought that there was going to be some kind of clarifying payoff to all of that world building at the end of the book that would make the whole thing and the whole concept of it just like snap into place. And unfortunately, there wasn't. And in fact, everything kind of started to go downhill in the back half, especially in the sense of how all of the commentary that was done with such a light touch in the first half of the book becomes extremely heavy-handed and expository in the second half. And the conceit of all of those different roles and stages and scripts also turned out to be much more literal than I had been hoping. And you know, once I realized that Charles Yu is a writer for Westworld, all of that lack of conceptual payoff did make a little bit more sense. So this book was ultimately a disappointment, which is a bummer, but I will say I have been thinking about it a little bit more recently because I've been watching Warrior on HBO Max, which I highly recommend. It's a show that follows the 19th century Chinatown gang wars in San Francisco, and it's just been interesting to think about in the context of interior Chinatown because every guy on that show is basically Kung Fu guy, but then also has this fully formed and fully realized identity outside of that. But then, of course, whenever they step outside of Chinatown, they are also reduced to generic Asian man number one at best. So it was ultimately an interesting and thought-provoking read. I don't not recommend it, but it also just didn't fully live up to its initial potential. Next up, I have Let Me Tell You What I Mean by Joan Didion, which is a new collection of 12 previously published Joan Didion essays. This book just came out from Knopf, and I read an early copy of it on NetGalley, and I would say that this book is definitely worth reading if you, like me, are a Joan Didion stan, but I would also say that it definitely reads like an attempt on the part of her publisher to wring everything they can out of her archive before she dies. They did a somewhat similar thing with South and West a couple of years ago, although that was a collection of previously unpublished notes. And I do think that Didion is a significant enough writer that it is valuable and worthwhile to kind of collect some of her more disparate pieces into easily accessible collections. I think it's a good thing for posterity, but on its own as a standalone book, I would say that Let Me Tell You What I Mean does read like a bit of a grab bag assortment of Didion's lesser work. And don't get me wrong, Joan Didion is, at least for me, always a pleasure to read, but this also obviously is not her best stuff, and there's no real focus or thematic cohesion to any of the pieces included here. It all just kind of feels a bit random. And a lot of the pieces here are also from a column that she used to write for the Saturday Evening Post, and so in those pieces you can also feel the ways in which she is constrained by the word count requirements. That being said, I did really enjoy the essay on being unchosen by the college of one's choice, which is about Joan Didion getting rejected from Stanford. And then her essay about Hemingway and Hemingway's cultural legacy was super fascinating, and I say that as a committed Hemingway hater. And finally, a lot of people have pointed out how the last essay of the book, which was originally published in 2000 and looks at Martha Stewart's empire and cult of personality, seems to have foreshadowed in some ways, the influencer industry. So there is some genuinely good stuff in this book. I would just say that there are many, many other Joan Didion books that you should prioritize before diving into this one. Next up, I have the best book that I read in December and January, which is a collection of poetry called Whereas by Layli Long Soldier. Layli Long Soldier is an Oglala Lakota poet, and in this collection, she really looks at and explores language, which seems like maybe an obvious thing to say about a book of poetry, but in several of these poems, she takes individual words, some English, some Lakota, and really breaks down their various parts and meanings and follows the thread of their various connotations. In one poem, for example, she breaks down the meaning of the term leftist, and in another poem, she looks at the Lakota word wakalyapi, which is an everyday word for coffee, but can also refer to anything that is boiled. And that second definition leads her into these images of rabbits being boiled and oleander growing over chain link fences and a childhood memory of a black pet rabbit left out in the sun too long. And it's just a beautiful way to demonstrate how language is this living, breathing, dynamic, shifting thing. At times a pathway to memory, and at other times a keeper of culture and identity and experiences. At the same time, she also considers words like opaque and how opaque to her sounds like the exact opposite of what it means. And in that way, she considers the limitations of language and the ways in which language can be quite arbitrary and is very much a construction. And she digs deeper into that idea in particular in the second half of the book, where she looks at the language behind various US government treaties and promises and proclamations. And in doing so, she maps out the many misdirections and misrepresentations and deceptions of language, the simultaneous power of language, and also its utter emptiness at times. And I just thought this book was wonderful. It is full of so many beautiful images and also so many thought-provoking considerations. And while I don't always feel super well equipped to talk about poetry and to discuss all of the subtleties of craft and structure and syntax that are sometimes at play in a work of poetry, I did really appreciate what Layli Long Soldier was doing in this book in terms of language and image and sound, and also in terms of spaces and silences. So I highly encourage you to go check this one out. And lastly, I have The Eagles of Heart Mountain, a true story of football, incarceration, and resistance in World War II America by Bradford Pearson. This is a nonfiction book that looks at Japanese American incarceration during World War II, and specifically at the Heart Mountain camp in Wyoming, where the kids at the high school there formed a football team, the Heart Mountain Eagles, that went on to have an undefeated season. And I heard Amina recommend this book on a recent episode of the Call Your Girlfriend podcast, and I also ended up picking it up just out of curiosity because one of my very good friends studies and does a lot of work around Japanese incarceration, and she's done a lot of stuff at Heart Mountain specifically. And a few years ago, I actually visited her while she was working out at the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center, which is a fantastic museum and National Historic Site. So I knew a bit about Heart Mountain going into this book, but I also had never heard about the football team specifically, which really is an amazing story. Someone out there should definitely make a movie about it. That being said, despite the title, I would say that this book is more of just a general introductory history of Japanese American incarceration during World War II with a little bit of football thrown in. I would say that football at best comprises maybe 20% of this book. Interestingly, Pearson spends almost as much time talking about Japanese American draft resistance, which is another fascinating story, as he does talking about the football team. And in fairness to him, I think that that's largely due to a lack of source material. Most of the Heart Mountain Eagles at this point have passed away, so while he does try to focus in on individual players and characters in order to tell this story, he looks, for example, at Babe Nomura, who was the most exceptional athlete at Heart Mountain by far. This book really is just lacking in those people's voices and perspectives, which is really just a shame, and there's nothing Pearson can do about that if that information segregation doesn't exist. And in addition to that, this book does feel a bit structurally lopsided in that almost all of the football happens in the last third of the book. But like I said, it's otherwise a really great introductory history to Japanese American incarceration, and what it lacks in terms of first-person accounts or oral histories, Pearson really makes up for with this focus on really granular historical details and anecdotes. I do think he sometimes burrows into the details a bit too much, like he introduces every team that the Eagles play against with excessive detail. At one point, he's talking about one of the teams and how they're from a town that suffered a mining disaster, and all of a sudden he's like describing the things that these kids' dads wrote on the wall of the mine like as they died, and it's just like too much. More relevantly though, there are a lot of great insights and details about all of the governmental and political and bureaucratic machinations that went into the imprisonment and relocation of 120,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast. And Pearson does a really good job of illustrating how that decision was driven much more by issues of labor and agriculture and anti-Asian and anti-Japanese racism than it was by any legitimate national security concerns. I do wish this book had had a bit more of a consideration of the significance of the Heart Mountain football team, not just as an act of resistance, but also in the context of questions of nationalism and national identity and assimilation. While reading this, I was thinking a bit about Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese, which is a novel that looks at hockey and Indigenous communities and Canadian national identity in really interesting ways. And I do think that you could consider similar questions in the context of this football team and this moment in American history. But I also get that that's kind of asking this book to be something that it's not. But that was just something that was on my mind while I was reading it. But anyway, I did think this was a really solid read, and I think it's a great, engaging entry point if you're interested in learning more about Japanese American incarceration during World War II. Those are some of the more literary books that I've been reading recently. Let me know what you have been reading to kick off 2021, and I will be back at you tomorrow talking about some of the romance novels I've read recently and to do some booktube shoutouts and February TBR talk. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!